It's not easy to get a handle on Black America. There are an awful lot of African Americans doing awfully well.
This is for you, Billy.
Cultural heroes are commonplace. Black stars are dominant in the sports world. And there are fabulously successful African Americans in media and the fine arts.
The door tonight has been opened.
And of course, Barack Obama was elected to 2 terms as president. But at the same time, Black America has been racked by terrible poverty,
our voice won't be silenced no more.
Too much tragic violence, and disastrous relations with law enforcement at every level.
I can't breathe. Oh my God, please don't tell me he's dead.
Where does the middle class fit into this picture? I'm Bob Herbert. For nearly half a century, I've covered some of the biggest stories and most important issues to face the American people. As a reporter and a columnist at the Daily News in New York, at NBC News, and at the New York Times. This is a story about race, about persistent, depraved, often murderous racial prejudice and discrimination, and especially how that racism has affected the Black middle class. The United States views a strong middle class, not just as an ideal, but as its proudest creation. But the Black middle class is not and never has been the same as the white middle class. Whites talk about working hard and playing by the rules, but Blacks have always had to play by a different, hateful set of hideously unfair rules. Working hard has never been enough for Black Americans to flourish. Nearly 40% of all Black children in America are poor. The Black unemployment rate is twice that of whites. For every dollar of wealth in the hands of the average white family in America, the typical Black family has just a little more than a nickel. Why these terrible disparities are still the case, a century and a half after slavery and a half century after the heyday of the civil rights movement, is what I'll try to explain in this documentary.
I think the perception of Blacks in general is either what you see on TV. You have both ends of the spectrum. You see folks who are very poor, crime-ridden neighborhoods, or you see the Blacks that are uber wealthy like you see on TV. There's nobody in the middle they have a nice home, they make a decent living, but they're not uber rich. And I think the perception is that there is no middle for us. I think the ones in the middle just kind of get dismissed or not even thought about.
But you're real.
We're here, we're real.
The Black middle class is real, all right, but it's fragile. It's not the same as the white middle class.
White families have about $113,000 in financial assets or wealth, and that average African-American family has $5,700. That's a pretty devastating gap.
80% of African Americans have a net worth below the median net worth of white Americans.
80%.
80%. Meaning that fundamentally, the notion of economic stability that middle class connotes is something that African Americans are still striving towards. About a third of African Americans have no assets. Zero.
The disturbing truth is that America's Black middle class has never been as large or as robust as most people, including most Black people, have wanted to believe. To get a real understanding of why this is the case, we have to take a look back. In the early part of the 20th century, 90% of African Americans lived in the South. To say that they were oppressed, treated cruelly, is an understatement. They were treated as if they were subhuman. Elijah Cummings is a U.S. congressman from Maryland. He's also the son and grandson of Southern sharecroppers. Cummings and his wife, Dr. Maya Rockymore, are exploring his family's origins in South Carolina.
Meaning he had to have been born
in slavery, right, Isaac.
Isaiah was born in 1885, right after.
Isaiah Cummings was my grandfather, and he fell sick on a Sunday. And they brought him home, And some kind of way they got two doctors to come out, and two white doctors, an old one and a younger one. And so the young doctor said, you know, we need to really get this man to a hospital or else he's going to die. And the older white doctor said, don't worry about him, he's only And that night, my grandfather died. And my father, to his death, I think was very upset about that.
Slavery ended, but things didn't change. People still lived on land that was owned by others. They still worked for profits that went to others. Working conditions were harsh. Children weren't getting educated. There was a lot of illness, early death, and people didn't see a way out. Sharecropping was nothing but slavery under a different name, and that was the status of a lot of black people.
My grandmother's house was basically a wood cabin, and literally you could look through the floor and see the ground. My father would work from sunup to sundown, plowing fields, picking cotton, strawberries, tobacco. He was truly a sharecropping farmer, and back then got very, very little per day.
Sharecroppers often worked year after year for no money. They were cheated by landowners and had virtually no legal recourse.
They would take the kids out of school at an early age to work the fields. To work the fields. You wouldn't, we were talking about when we ride up here, ride through all this land, somebody had to plow this land.
And they shut down the schools during harvest time so that the kids could come out and help with the harvest.
It's hard to imagine the growth of a healthy black middle class from this wretched soil.
There are many examples of Southern governors and lawmakers who would say, well, what would be the point of investing in education for these people who, when all we need them to be is a cook or domestic or to work in the field, how much education could they need?
James K. Vardaman was explicit on that point. Governor of Mississippi and then U.S. Senator in the early 1900s, he had sworn to lynch every black person in the state if necessary to maintain white supremacy. The only effect of education, Vardaman said, was to spoil a good field hand and make an insolent cook.
It was a regime of totalitarianism in some ways.
Whatever you had could be taken away the moment some white woman accused a black man of looking at her the wrong way. A white family thought that a black family was doing too well, getting uppity. People tried to exercise a few rights, suggest that they had them. Any of those things could get you lynched.
It was against the law for a black person and a white person to just play checkers together in Birmingham. Everything you could imagine was segregated. There were separate elevators, there were separate staircases, there were separate taxi cabs. And so that meant that at every turn, at every moment, every single thing that you did, you had to be keenly aware and observant and vigilant as to where you happened to be and making sure that you were not crossing the line. Any breach of that caste system could mean injury, attack, and even death.
And always there was the violence.
They took them and put them in jail and they beat them. And then they got together on a Saturday. And they tied them with barbed wire, hand and feet. They put barbed wire around the neck and put the father on one side of the bumper and the son on the other side of the bumper. They drug them all over the town. And after that, they were drugged to the neighborhood. They were told that this is the way that we're going to keep in this place.
Even in that violent, hateful, repressive environment, some faint stirrings of a black middle class could be felt.
You had African-American professionals and business people, funeral parlors and undertakers. They served the African-American community. Their jobs and livelihood did not depend on working for a white company, a white family, or a white institution.
Mariel's mother, Sybil, a teacher and community leader in New Orleans, grew up in that environment.
We had a very comfortable life in this bubble where we were protected because we were among our own and dependent on our own. And there was a lot of entertaining. I guess we mimicked the white society. My mother entertained with organizations like the Lynx and the Boulé. But you were inside this secure bubble, and you stepped beyond, and it was another world. You knew your limitations. When a white person was walking on the sidewalk and a black would be walking toward them, they had to step down off the curb to let the white person pass. You knew what not to do. You knew not to step beyond the Louisiana laws.
But blacks who improved their lot were always at risk. A small enclave of prosperous black entrepreneurs in Tulsa, Oklahoma, became known as the Wall Street. They had their own shops, banks, newspapers, restaurants, and theaters, the makings of a self-sustaining middle class. But in May 1921, riots broke out when blacks tried to stop an angry white mob from lynching a young black man. Black homes and businesses were attacked with firebombs and gunfire, and the National Guard was called up. The violence lasted 16 hours. When it was over, the Wall Street was wiped out. The deprivation, the horrors, and the humiliation would eventually prove unbearable.
They tried the South, they tried to stay in the South, and after a while, they were just done. Lynchings were still happening. Jim Crow was still very much there. Separate but equal was a joke. And a lot of people just said, let's just go north.
They came out of the South by the millions in search of a better life for themselves and their children. They carried very little besides the clothes on their back, a package with just enough food for their journey, and a dream. Unnoticed by most journalists, unacknowledged by early historians, their journey came to be known as the Great Migration.
The Great Migration was an outpouring of 6 million African Americans from the South to the North, the Midwest, and West. It was a search for freedom, a search for the ability to pursue their dreams for both themselves and for their children.
Their main objective was paid employment.
In the first part of the last century, the labor force, certainly of white males, was being siphoned off into the war effort.
Well, they were recruiting. The northern businesses, the northern industries, railroads, and the factories and the steel mills of the North needed labor, and they went to the South to find them because they were looking for the cheapest labor in the land, which would have meant African Americans. When the recruiters came, they actually had to take great care in doing so because it turned out that there was great resistance in the South to this poaching.
Resistance among whites?
Yes.
Whites in the South did not want blacks to leave.
They did not want the labor to leave.
We have a good set of Negroes here, and they don't want to be disturbed. Of course, there are some getting some ideas, and that's all right. That's progress. But we've got some mighty good darkies here.
The Great Migration was the largest internal migration in America's history.
There are a lot of legendary railroad lines that we associate with the Great Migration now. The Illinois Central, City of New Orleans is one of the most legendary railroad routes. There were 3 streams that the people used to escape One was up the East Coast, which carried people from Florida, Georgia, the Carolinas, and Virginia to Washington, D.C., and Philadelphia and New York up the East Coast of our country. And then there was the Midwest stream from Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, and Arkansas to Chicago and Detroit, Cleveland, Minneapolis. And then there was the West Coast stream, which carried people from Texas and Louisiana out to California, and then all the way up to Washington State and even beyond. Some people drove all the way out, particularly when they went out to the West Coast. It could be perilous because Jim Crow extended beyond the borders of the South in many cases where if they were driving, they had to be very cautious. There were lots of places where they could not necessarily be assured of getting gas, could not be assured of getting a room for the night, could not be assured of being able to get food or to be able to eat it in a restaurant.
People didn't know that they were trading a challenging situation, a difficult situation, a harsh situation in the South, indeed for a new form of discrimination and exclusion, indeed in the North.
For one thing, the promise of good jobs was vastly overstated. Some blacks found lower echelon work in the factories of industrial cities, but for most, the only option was menial labor, sometimes of the most humiliating variety.
All right, James, let's get going, son.
This humiliation, accepted as normal by most whites, was often captured in the popular entertainment of the time.
Any more sandwiches?
Oh, sure, I got lots of them.
Good night, Miss Will.
Black people really weren't allowed to get really good jobs. Domestic work overwhelmingly is what black women did.
My mother, she worked in a pickle factory, if I recall correctly, and then she did a lot of domestic work. Dad was a laborer, lifting drums, breathing chemicals all day.
Men participated in all sorts of, whether it was cutting grass, gardening, cooks, drivers, janitorial workers. The jobs that were at the very bottom of the economy substantially were held by African Americans. A good job was being a Pullman car porter.
Blacks considered Pullman porter to be a middle-class job.
The thing that made it middle class was that they were being paid relatively well, particularly compared to other African Americans, and they had a uniform and they were moving about with, important and respected people. So it was a revered occupation to have, and yet it's an indication that still, essentially, these were people who were servants.
For a lot of blacks, the only route to a decent job was self-employment. My family was a family of tradespeople. They were upholsterers. My mother was a seamstress, my father was an upholsterer, my grandfather was an upholsterer. I cannot believe that my grandfather's old upholstery shop is now this boutique restaurant. It used to say R.S. Herbert Upholstering, established 1927. This door right here, I came in and out of that door a million times when I was like, I don't know, 7, 8, 9 years old, right on up through high school. I used to work here after school. This place was really important to my family because my grandfather owned the shop during the Depression, and he had 5 kids, and it kept his family from being destitute. In those days in Montclair, if you were black, there was not much in the form of gainful employment to be had. But if you had a business, that was different. And my grandfather had a business. Largely shut out of private employment, the real route to the middle class for overwhelming numbers of blacks was government employment, as teachers in black neighborhoods, for example, or lower-level municipal workers, or in the post office.
The post office not only offered a good career in and of itself, but you could get a part-time job at the post office. You could teach during the day and you could sort mail at night. You could put together a pretty decent living.
My grandfather got a good government job. He was the driver of a trash truck in Norwalk, Connecticut, which I guess was supposed to be somewhat prestigious that you were the driver, not actually picking up the trash. They were able to buy a home in Norwalk. They always said that they had a great life. Like in my dad's mind, they didn't consider themselves poor. By some people's standards, they might have, but they didn't consider themselves poor.
In that era, which lasted through much of the 20th century, it didn't matter if you were black, how smart you were, or how hard you worked. Blacks were seen as a servant class, and that's the way they were treated. Even highly accomplished black professionals had a hard time making it into the middle class. Black doctors were shunned by white patients and were not allowed to practice in white hospitals or join white medical associations. Sybil Moriel's father was a doctor.
My father grew up on a farm. He went to Straight College, which is now Dillard University, but there was no medical school here. So he went to Howard University, and he interned at Freedman's Hospital. He came home and opened a practice. But what's interesting is that they could not take their patients or even set foot in the white hospitals.
I'll never forget, I went to my 6th grade counselor. He said, "What do you want to be?" I said, "I want to be a lawyer." And he said, "You can never be a lawyer." He said, "Your father is a laborer. He didn't go very far in school. Your mama didn't either." He said, "There's no way." He said, I think you need to aim a little lower. And then he said these words that have lived with me for every day of my life. He asked me the question, "Who do you think you are?"
So this counselor is essentially slamming the door on the dream of a 6th grader.
That's right.
Instead of opening the door.
Yeah. So I found my whole life, almost everything I did was trying to prove him wrong.
Z. Scott is a former federal prosecutor who grew up in deeply segregated Shreveport, Louisiana, and now lives in Chicago. When she graduated from law school, a career in corporate law was virtually out of the question.
The opportunities were limited. At the time, most lawyers of color were in government because there were no opportunities in private practice.
So you basically couldn't get a job.
The stories you hear of, I went into a law firm for an interview. When I walked through the door, the person interviewing me looked at me, didn't want to take my coat. When I sat down, they spent the rest of the interview telling me how horrible it was to work there. And then I got my coat and I left. That wasn't the only time I had that sort of experience where a couple of interviews in, this is not a welcome place.
So it was pretty much a government job or bust.
That was pretty much it.
The quest for a black middle class, severely hampered by the lack of decent employment, was made all the more horrendous by the vicious and often violent refusal of whites to allow blacks into decent housing. It was a crisis faced immediately by blacks who were part of the Great Migration.
Chicago, for example, the neighborhoods that African Americans had moved into had previously been lived in by waves of Lithuanians or Italians or Greek immigrants. That housing stock had been old to begin with and not necessarily maintained very well because these have been rentals. And then when African Americans arrived, they arrived in such large numbers that the owners ended up subdividing those homes to make what they would call kitchenette apartments, where there would be sometimes multiple families living in a 2 or 3 room apartment sharing a kitchenette. They were actually paying more per square foot than almost anyone else in the city, not because of the high quality of the housing, but because the demand was so great that the landlords could charge them more for less. And then on top of that, where they were living, they were actually considered the vice districts of these cities, where they might never have chosen to be, but these were the only neighborhoods that they were permitted to live in.
This is the first building on this block where a white owner sold to a black resident. This was a solidly white area, and it was a solidly white block, and Chicago's a very segregated city, and there was a very small area where black people lived. It was called the Black Belt.
We're talking about a narrow strip, roughly from about 35th Street down to about 47th Street. That's where all African Americans were in the city of Chicago.
The black families are not allowed into the suburbs. They called it the Chicago Wall, the wall around Chicago keeping black people in.
There were instances when blacks began to move onto a block where you would see an open amount of hostility to that family moving into the block.
A bus driver, Harvey Clark, rented an apartment here on July 11th, 1951.
Clark, an Army veteran, and his wife Janetta tried to move outside the Black Belt of Chicago to Cicero.
He was a bus driver. She was taking care of their 2 young children. They had been living in that narrow band of space to which African Americans were consigned on the south side of Chicago at that time. And so when they found this apartment, they were thrilled to be able to find a place that was actually convenient to his work. And upon arrival, they were met with the sheriff and other authorities who would not permit them to go in. They then had to go and get a court order to move into the apartment that they had already rented. They returned with the court order to move in. But as they were moving in, there was a crowd that began to swell. At one point, there were 4,000 people who gathered around them, so hostile that they were not permitted to actually move in themselves that night. And after they left, some people in the mob went into the apartment, ransacked it, and they ended up wrenching the radiators and the faucets and the toilets and the sinks out of the wall and hurling them out of the window.
This is like a crazed mob.
A crazed mob. They then set the whole building afire so that no one could live in the building.
They hurled fire bombs, rocks, and bottles at the building. Before the disturbance was over, martial law had been declared in the area. In all, 23 persons were injured, a dozen others arrested.
As more people arrived, they began to push the boundaries further and further as to where they could live, merely because they were bursting with little in the way of options to where they were. As they attempted to leave, that's when they ran into the redlining.
Well, the redlining is remarkably descriptive. Insurance companies and banks had maps where they literally drew red lines on the map around neighborhoods. And so this is an area that we are not going to lend in. Typically what would happen is that a bank or an insurance company would make a decision about the racial composition of the neighborhood. So if it began to transition to an African-American neighborhood, it was deemed as too risky, right? Too risky to grant mortgages in that neighborhood or to insure properties.
Because banks refused to loan, black people were left with the alternative of buying on contract, which is essentially the same as buying on an installment plan.
There are blocks like this scattered throughout the Lawndale section of Chicago's West Side ghetto. The people who live here bought their homes from real estate speculators at double or triple their value, and they bought on contract because they couldn't get conventional or FHA mortgages. Under the contract, the buyer makes installment payments at high interest, but he bills no equity. If he defaults on even one payment at any time during the contract, he loses the property and everything he's paid into it.
Contract sellers and other speculators were making so much money, they began to deliberately panic whites into leaving their neighborhoods.
What would happen is a salesman would go to your door and say, "Hi, are you interested in selling?" And you'd say, "No, not really." They'd say, "Fine, you don't want to sell? Don't worry. I'll be back in a week and I'll offer you $1,000 less. You should know, blacks are coming. Your home will be worth less very soon. Sell now, get out while you can." Often middle-class black families would be the first to move into a white area.
4338, that's the address.
What happened here, it's a good example of the kind of violence that black families faced. This particular house was purchased in 1959 by a black couple, Josh and Barbara Hargrave, and they had 4 children. They could afford to move to this area. They put in $9,000 down payment at a time when a $1,000 down payment was considered quite good. Once they moved into the property and people saw who was living there, you had 3 days of rioting in the streets, from 1,000 to 5,000 white people in the streets, stoning the building, throwing lighted torches at the building. People would go around to the back porch, which is wooden, and try to set fire to it. They were chanting, "We want blood. You know, get out of here, we don't want you here."
So these riots became a common occurrence.
They were common. People talked about it summer after summer. this whole history of white rioting and white violence has been historically buried. When people think of violence and riots in the street, they always think of the 1960s when black people rioted, but when white people rioted, it doesn't even have a name.
My understanding is that when these mobs just sort of got out of control, they would be screaming the worst kinds of things.
And that was quite traumatic for parents and children alike. Parents who don't want their children to hear such a thing. Imagine seeing this. So yeah, they'd be screaming, go home, die, die. In other neighborhoods in Chicago, they had little chants like, I wish I was an Alabama trooper. That's what I would like to be, because if I was an Alabama trooper, I could murder legally. Martin Luther King, when he came to Chicago, said that people in Mississippi should come to Chicago to learn how to hate.
How do you feel about this reception, sir?
Well, this is a terrible thing. I've been in many demonstrations all across the South, but I can say that I have never seen, even in Mississippi and Alabama, mobs as hostile and as hate-filled as I've seen here in Chicago.
But the march will go on.
You find your pleasure in someone else's pain. Not a cloud in the sky. You will still find a way to make it rain.
One of the heartbreaking things about the whole situation was that basically black people and white people were pursuing the same middle-class values. They wanted to save money, they wanted to invest in a property that they could take care of and call their own. But when white people did that, they were rewarded, as you would expect, with property, usually property appreciation and a sense of stability. But when black people followed the same identical path of attempting to save and invest, they were punished. It becomes a method of luring them into a trap that will end up draining them of wealth instead of helping them to build wealth.
This project represents the future of a great city.
One of the responses to the influx of people from the South to the North was the federal government with local governmental authorities built these massive public housing developments, Cabrini Green, Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis, these massive concentrations. When you look at the old brochures and sales pitches that were made, what people were told is that these were going to be well-kept, as nice as any penthouse, that there were going to be services provided, that this was going to be improved housing, and it was going to be temporary housing. And to some extent, people were sold a bill of goods, and it became almost a sanctioned warehousing.
While law and custom kept blacks warehoused in inner cities, the mammoth federal interstate highway system, financed by taxpayers, was opening up suburbs all across the country. This created enormous amounts of both good jobs and new housing. But once again, African Americans were left out. Blacks were not welcome in the construction and other trades, and they were systematically prevented from moving into the suburbs. For example, they were kept out of the affordable Levittown communities in New York and Pennsylvania. These gateways to the middle class were initially marked white only. So this is all what's considered Upper Montclair. Nice homes. When I was growing up, my family and I could not have lived in any of these homes in Upper Montclair. Blacks were just not welcome. You wouldn't be able to buy a home. If you had the down payment, you most likely would not be able to get a mortgage. In those days, even ads in the newspapers for rentals would say, whites only, white tenancy. And this is in Montclair, New Jersey in the 1950s and 60s. We're not talking about the South. Elijah Cummings' parents settled in Baltimore, Maryland. In 1964, the family had saved enough money to move to a better neighborhood. Congressman?
Hey, Bob.
Good to see you.
Good seeing you too.
Right.
This is my brother, James.
James?
When we moved up here, we thought we were moving into heaven. We had moved from a very small house where we were pretty much on top of each other, really. And now we had 4 bedrooms and had a club cellar. Even had a, not only did we have a dining room, but had a breakfast room.
Look out.
And real grass.
And real grass.
Real grass, right. Despite the low expectations of his 6th grade counselor, Elijah Cummings studied hard and found a fast track to his dreams. He earned a spot at one of America's leading black colleges, Howard University, in Washington, D.C.
My father took me to Howard, and before he let me out, he said, boy, he said, your mama and me, we done brought you as far as we can. He said, you know, we didn't have that much education. He said, but we're gonna leave you in the hands of these smart people up here, and they're gonna give you a good education. When I got to Howard, it was far, far, far more than I ever dreamed of. I had never seen that many black professionals anywhere in one place. I knew I was on my way.
Cummings became a lawyer, his childhood dream, and in 1996, he was elected to Congress.
When I became a congressman, my father came to see me, get sworn in. He was in the balcony. Newt Gingrich was swearing me in. And my father was crying. I'd never seen my daddy cry. I said, Daddy, you crying? Why you crying? I said, you crying because you're so happy that I became a congressman? He said, I'm really proud of you. You know, he said, don't get me wrong. I'm really proud of you. I know that in this place, they used to call us slaves. In this place, they called us 3/5 of a man. In the same place, they call us chattel. He said, so I'm really proud that they now gonna call you a congressman. He said, but the thing that made me cry was that realizing that I was deprived of an education, I now realize what I could have been. And every single time I walk through the halls of Congress, I think about that. Now, a man who was slowly approaching his death, talking about what he could have been.
We're coming to an area where my father had 2 stores in the 1960s and 70s on Main Street in Orange, New Jersey. In those days, this was a pretty thriving middle-class business district. My father was one of the few black business owners. So the main reason these shops did so well had to do with the clientele, most of whom came from the suburbs. That's where the money was, that's where my father's customers came from. They were heady times for my old man and for my mom. What they needed, though, and what my father wanted, was to expand. So I would be with him when he was talking with other business owners. These were white business owners who had larger businesses than my father. And they liked my old man, and they liked the work that he did. And so they would say, Chester, you have to expand your business. And they'd say, get a bank loan. So funny, you know, get a bank loan. He needed to raise capital, so the answer was get a bank loan. Well, he couldn't get a bank loan. They weren't giving bank loans to guys who looked like my father. It wasn't just the private sector throwing up these maddening roadblocks. In 1935, Congress enacted Social Security only after Southern segregationists were assured its benefits would not go to agricultural and domestic workers, the jobs held by most blacks. So, for example, a woman could work faithfully for 40 years as a maid and then retire with no pension, no Social Security, no money at all. Blacks fought valiantly in World War II, but when they came home, they found that in many states, especially in the South, they were being denied the benefits of the GI Bill. Those benefits lifted millions of whites into the middle class in the years after the Second World War. I frankly found it remarkable that blacks were able to establish any kind of economic foundation in the U.S. With every improvement in their economic or social circumstances, black Americans met resistance from white supremacists. And yet, by the mid-1960s, a significant black middle class existed, and it was growing. The civil rights movement and the policies of President Lyndon B. Johnson substantially improved the quality of life for black Americans. Congress passed and Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
We seek not just freedom, but opportunity. We seek not just legal equity, but human ability. Not just equality as a right and a theory, but equality as a fact and equality as a result.
Even as riots were raging in the wake of the assassination of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., Johnson signed the Fair Housing Act of 1968. It prohibited discrimination in the sale, rental, and financing of housing based on race, religion, national origin, and sex. Throughout the 60s and 70s, black students were enrolling in colleges and universities in greater numbers, and affirmative action policies were prying open additional doors of opportunity. Most important of all, in terms of the growth of the black middle class, was the continued growth in the access of government jobs for blacks. Government employment at the federal, state, and local level, including management and supervisory jobs in the agencies created during the War on Poverty, has, more than any other single factor, lifted large numbers of blacks out of poverty and into the middle class. With so much bias in the private sector, there wouldn't be much of a black middle class at all without government employment.
More and more millions of Americans turn.
But as the black middle class grew, it met with a fierce backlash. New but equally insidious strategies of resistance were developed by white leaders.
And we're going to enforce the law, and Americans should remember that if we're going to have law and order.
With coded language and deceitful policy pronouncements designed to disguise hostility to blacks.
Government is not the solution to our problem. Government is the problem.
Listen to Lee Atwater, a key advisor to Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush, explaining how to get racist whites to vote for Republicans.
You start out in 1954 by saying, by 1968 you can't say that hurts you, backfire, so you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights and all that stuff. And you're getting so abstract now, you're talking about cutting taxes, and all of these things you're talking about are totally economic things, and the byproduct of them is blacks get hurt worse than whites. You follow me? Because obviously sitting around saying, we want to cut taxes, we want to cut this, and we want, is much more abstract than even the busing thing. And a hell of a lot more abstract than, you know.
Reagan opened his 1980 general election campaign near Philadelphia, Mississippi, where in 1964, 3 young civil rights workers were brutally murdered by white supremacists. Reagan made a sly reference to the enthusiastic white crowd that had come to that notorious site to hear him.
I believe in states' rights.
States' rights was the term that had long been used to justify first slavery, then segregation. Everyone recognized it as a dog whistle that signals support for bigotry.
If we just reflect on the fact that for 250 years we had slavery, 100 years of Jim Crow, and there's all of this indoctrination that you're inferior and your life is not worth very much because you're black, I think a lot of that was internalized. I still see a lot of black people, even professional black people, who internally struggle with feelings of inferiority, that they still have to prove themselves. I know I did that.
Poussin did his psychiatric training at UCLA.
I couldn't get an apartment in Westwood, where UCLA was, because they didn't rent to blacks. And then I met the same type of prejudice among doctors and the trainees at UCLA, where one doctor invited me to his party, the chief of the department, and one of the residents, white residents, came and said the invitation was just as being polite. He doesn't really want you to come, that he believes in segregation, and he was recruited from a southern university. Embedded in all of this, these values and behaviors, was white supremacy.
That bigotry is a reality that has touched virtually every African American. Sybil Moriel recalled what it was like when she headed off to Boston to college.
I went on a train to Boston. I went to Boston University. My father brought me to the train station. We had to go around the corner to the back entrance to go in. When you walked up to the train, the porter said, "Go in here." That was the first car behind the engine. That was the colored car. And half of it was the baggage car. It was the baggage car. So we had to go, he said, go up the steps and go to your right.
So black people, called colored people in those days, had to ride in the same car with the baggage.
That's right. There was a division, but it was half was for baggage and half for colored people.
By this time you're of college age. You have a real familiarity with what's going on. How'd you feel?
Well, it didn't feel good, but it was a reality. And so you adjusted to it. It's very interesting. The dining car setup was, we could eat in the dining car, but you were seated at this table next to the kitchen. And after you were seated, they drew a curtain around you.
The exclusion, the deliberate humiliation, the violence, the nonstop discrimination, it all fed a pervasive anger and often rage among blacks that most often was kept under wraps.
My father, when he came home from work, he would always sit in his car. I don't care how cold it was or how hot it was. And I said, "Dad, why do you do that? Why do you do that?" He said, "Because the pain, the racism and stuff I was going through was so rough on me. I wanted to make sure I did not come into my family angry and then take it out on them."
I remember my first year as a federal prosecutor, the things that happened in the office, people coming up to you, ask you to type for them, and going into courtrooms, people assuming that you were the court clerk, asking you when the judge is going to come on the bench. And I recall a friend of mine, we were working together, she went to court as the government's attorney, and she's black, and the judge said, it'd be great if the government had shown up, because he assumed that she was black. That meant she was the defendant in the case. Things like that happened day in, day out. And, because black professionals, we're all suppressing a certain amount of rage. The rage from being, people treating you as if you're not competent, that you don't deserve to be in the chair that you're sitting in. And it's something that you have to manage. But it's just not healthy to live like that.
Despite everything, despite the long, hard struggle, the racism and social marginalization, it looked as if the 21st century might be heralding a new era of increasing black prosperity. Wages had climbed modestly, unemployment rates had declined, and home ownership was up. One of the largest black middle-class communities in America is Prince George's County, Maryland, just outside Washington, D.C. Brent Swinton and his wife Carla live here with their 2 daughters. He's a professional fundraiser. She's in marketing.
Mom, when you make omelets, It's just not my taste.
Yes, it is.
Well, when you make scrambled eggs. But when I make omelets, the world stops and stares for a while.
They do.
To me, middle class means that we're not really rich, and we're not really poor.
Being black middle class means that wherever you've arrived, you've only been there just in the span of your life.
Rakes?
We may have arrived to a degree, but we just got here. So it's still not quite the same. I drive through a neighborhood in Bethesda, which is absolutely white. And they're not the wealthiest of the wealthy, but there's something that has gone on that takes place over more than one generation that allows them to pass along a much greater head start. I don't begrudge them anything because I want to do that for my kids. I want to leave them something tangible and valuable. But in general, people who have just crossed that finish line into being middle-class blacks, it's a new experience. Mommy always asks, how come I don't pay somebody to do this? Look, I've already done a quarter of a yard. Pretty soon you guys won't need me out here at all. You just handle it.
No.
The absence of wealth makes it extremely difficult for African American parents to pass their middle-class status along to their children. And there's nothing to fall back on if there's an economic reversal.
When you have no wealth or very little wealth, that means you have nothing to rely on. You have no assets that can be readily translated into cash.
You don't have anything to cushion the blow.
There's no cushion.
Right.
A big New York City.
That absence of wealth, a major weak spot in the fragile underpinnings of the black middle class, proved catastrophic when, almost without warning, the economy collapsed in the Great Recession and housing foreclosure crisis.
Big trouble for millions of American homeowners as a slowing housing market has turned some mortgages into time bombs.
Former Fed Chairman Alan Greenspan wrote the current crisis is likely to be the most wrenching since the end of the Second World War.
The entire middle class was hurt by the crisis, but for the black middle class, the economic setbacks were devastating.
The housing crisis in 2008 wiped out the wealth of black people, and they are not even close to recovering.
Decades of African American progress were reduced to ruins in a seeming instant.
Businesses, banks, and others, brokers, were functionally wealth stripping, deliberately wealth stripping from communities of color.
Like the contract buyers of old, blacks were targeted for bad loans.
If you're African American making more than $100,000, you were more likely to be put into a subprime loan than if you were a white person making less than $35,000.
Cross burnings are the most overt form of discrimination and bigotry. Lending discrimination is some of the most subtle. It's what I call discrimination with a smile.
The Great Recession and the housing crisis showed once again just how elusive the American dream has been for African Americans.
African Americans have not had a fair shot at the American dream. They've hardly had a fair shot at anything. And it is quite extraordinary that African Americans have managed to do as well as they have. The discrimination that has your house not earning any value, your job not paying as much as it would have paid if you had been white, and access to very few jobs has made it hard for black people to get on a highway to opportunity. They've been on little roads, back roads to opportunity, but haven't been on a highway.
Have African Americans had a fair shot at the American dream?
No. No, I don't think they've had a fair shot because they've been systematically discriminated against, and that has not disappeared. So no, I don't think we've had a fair shake at the American dream.
Have African Americans had a fair shot at the American dream?
No.
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 End of story.
End of story.
When I think of the black experience in America, the word that comes to mind is heroism. Black people, in the face of the worst kinds of exploitation and oppression, refuse to stay in their so-called place. They have refused to allow whites to confine them within social and economic boundaries defined by race. Always there was someone to take a stand. whether it meant resisting the terrors of Jim Crow, or the murderous violence of white supremacists, or the denial of the right to vote, or when parishioners are murdered in the sacred confines of houses of worship. The suffering has at times been unimaginable, and the great gleaming promise of America has never been as bright for Black Americans as it has been for whites. But none of that has mattered. Blacks have never given in. Millions of blacks have, in fact, made it into the American middle class, and some have even become very wealthy. Millions of young African Americans have graduated from college and gone on to distinguished careers. Statistics show that there is still a very long road to travel. There is far too much poverty and very little real wealth in the Black community. The criminal justice system is too often responsible for outright atrocities, and blacks have never approached the true heights of their educational potential. And even now, the rigging of the rules continues with voter suppression campaigns, the rollback of the Voting Rights Act, and the relentless assault on the government jobs so crucial to Black advancement. But no amount of cruelty or injustice will stop that Black advance. There are no barriers that can't be overcome. When dreams remain unrealized, it simply means the fight goes on.